Welcome to the Pink Tax Podcast, a no-nonsense podcast for millennial women, building wealth and smashing the patriarchy, $1 at a time, with your hosts, Janine and Tara.
Hi, Janine.
Hey, Tara.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. We kind of have a not so happy topic today, I guess, but I'm still really excited about it.
Yeah, I'm curious to see which direction this episode takes.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the financial implications of divorce and how to protect yourself.
Let's jump into it.
Okay. So I kind of took a deep dive into this. Full disclosure, I've never been divorced. Known a few divorced people. That's basically it.
And I've never been divorced either, but, it is something that we've seen increase in our society. Mm-hmm. As millennials have been married for a few years, I think it's probably less taboo than it has been in past generations.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think a lot of the preparations financially for divorce can actually set you up for a healthier relationship. Not because, you're prepping for the worst case scenario, because you're splitting your finances in a way that's healthier, I guess.
Yeah, and both parties being involved, there's, a lot of benefits from that as well.
Exactly. And transparency between the two of you and all that stuff. But we'll get into it. So, looked at a few studies. The first one I looked at was by a couple of economists, last names Hung and Knapp for the Rand Corporation, and they studied couples between their 30s and 50s. The takeaway from that was to divorce earlier, unless you're a woman. Early divorce can negatively impact you. Basically, what I found looking through a bunch of different studies was that divorce is always worse statistically for women.
Interesting.
Yeah. I was wondering what your thoughts were on why you think that might be.
Yeah, I was kind of a little bit taken by surprise that divorcing earlier is worse for women. Are you able to elaborate on why that might be?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things. So one of the last studies that I looked at was more recent by Thomas Leopold and published in 2018. And he was looking at the gender differences in divorce. And because women are traditionally the lower income earner, traditionally the person to stay at home with the kids, if you divorce early while you're not working, that's a huge impact, right? You have, it's harder to get back into the workforce. You have higher expenses because you're probably more likely to be the single parent. And on top of that, you don't have any earnings, like prior earnings in the last couple of years anyway, so you don't have anything to fall back on.
So I guess what you're saying then, when people are divorcing later, many of those women are back in the workforce kind of after they're finished raising kids?
Back in the workforce, or at least they don't have to be in the situation where they were taking care of their kids full-time at home, and now not only do they have to look at applying for jobs again, they have to look at childcare for their kids.
Makes sense. So again, I think we've touched on this before, but motherhood is a huge penalty for women across kind of all aspects of life.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about the high cost of childcare. So to have that on the lower income parent, and then the parent who's trying to re-enter the workforce if they're not there already, huge burden.
Yeah, that is huge to take on for one parent that, may have been out of the workforce for a significant period of time.
Yeah, and so one of the articles that I read as well by Hein back in 2008 said that the average decline for standard of living, and this was American women, is by 1/3.
Yikes, yeah. That's a lot.
It's huge, especially if you're going to be the person taking care of the kids, if you have kids. So the takeaway that I liked the most from the Leopold study was the findings suggest that men's disproportionate strain of divorce is transient, where women's is chronic. And I really liked that.
Yeah, I mean, I could see how especially from a financial perspective, some of those issues would just start to compound over the years and make it really challenging for women to get ahead later in life.
Exactly. So let's dig into it. As we kind of go through the different stages of relationships, I kind of wanted to touch on the big pieces that will be affected by divorce, but also that just should be talked about within an open relationship. So household debt, household income, childcare expenses or support if you are divorced or separated, real property, and the costs associated with getting a divorce. So, things to consider before you get married or cohabitate. My biggest suggestion right off the top would be to talk openly about your finances and your expectations in terms of career, spending, investing, even before you move into together, because common law relationships, they can claim a right to all the assets that have been gained during the time of the relationship. So I was wondering for you, Janine, how did you and your partner approach this?
Yeah, we definitely were open with our finances from day one. Prior to my relationship with my, I guess now husband, he was in a sense, a little bit of a financially abusive relationship where there was a lot of taking advantage of, and he ended up paying for a lot of things that maybe should have been split equally, especially when they were both students. So we were of the mindset that we would, try and ensure that that didn't happen in our relationship, and that there was no resentment when it came to money. So we sat down and talked about financial implications in our lives. He was living on his own, and I was living at my parents' house at the time. So, even before we moved in, we talked about, who would pay for dinner and those types of things, because I think it is important. And then I guess as our relationship progressed, we started saving for things together. I think our first purchase together was a KitchenAid mixer, and we still have it. So
nice. It's lasted.
And then, we started saving for vacations. And then at that point, I think we had started talking about moving in and how we would split our expenses.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's really good that you talked about everything prior to moving in together. I think that's a big step that's missed that I've seen in friendships and talking to coworkers and that kind of thing. People just seem to move in together and just say, oh, well, we're just gonna split the rent. To a certain degree, that's how I thought of it when me and my now husband moved in together. I thought, well, okay, it's just going to be splitting the rent, because prior to that I said I'm not going to move in with somebody unless I'm engaged or that serious that if marriage is off the table that we would be engaged. We ended up moving in together a lot more quickly than that. But we did talk about finances and what we could afford. We were both students at the time, both had very small incomes, that kind of thing. Both knew we were debt averse, both knew that we were kind of on the fence about kids. I think we talked about kids on our second date. So we just brought a lot of stuff out into the open, and we've just always been really aligned in terms of finances and investing.
And I think if you sit down and actually talk about maybe, the first couple dates, you don't talk about kids. I know that's maybe not for everyone, but even talking about things that are values and priorities to you, is having a large sum of money in case something bad happens a priority, or is traveling a priority, or what are those priorities? And I think when we start to dig into priorities and values, you will probably have a better understanding of how your partner spends their money. I think that is how a lot of relationships end up breaking down, is, money being the number one cause of divorce. People just not understanding one person's a spender, one person's a saver, and they're always butting heads.
Yeah. And I was going to bring that up too. I mean, if you're not on the same page financially, or you can't find a way to compromise and get on the same page financially, that's going to be a huge issue going forward. And if you're not the kind of person that can call your partner out, or your partner can't call you out reasonably. I know when we were planning our wedding, huge expense, huge cost, a lot of those kind of things came out of the woodwork, and it really tested us. It made us see, where some flaws that we hadn't seen in each other were. So it was great. If you really want to test your relationship, definitely plan a wedding and at the same time renovate a house, fully gut a house. That's what we did.
That's a lot. That is a lot of financial stress all at once.
Yeah, we put ourselves really to the test. Okay, so that's cool. So something that my husband and I have done almost from the beginning, right after we moved in together, we started combining our finances partially. So we had a joint account to pay for rent and other household items. So mops, cleaning supplies, groceries, that kind of thing. It just made sense to us, but we still had our separate accounts. At that point, we still had we still do have completely separate investments, and we didn't have any joint debt at the time. Now we have joint debt in the form of mortgage. We still have our joint account, which is now our main transacting account. We don't have any joint credit cards. We've always had separate credit. He is an authorized user on some of mine. I'm an authorized user on his. And all our investments are separate except for our kids' RESP. Yeah.
I think, too, in Canada, there isn't a lot of opportunity to have joint investments, right? Like when we're looking at the TFSA and the RSP, which are most people's main investment accounts, and we'll be talking about this in the next episode, but they do have to be individual accounts. So it's a lot more challenging to have joint investments, I think, in Canada.
But you can, even though you're supposed to be the one making the decision in the TFSA and the RSP accounts, you can have it, and I've seen kind of some studies on it, where women or the lower income earner do pass off that responsibility to their partner, and take a step back from it and just say, oh, they'll manage the finances, I'm just going to take a back seat, even though that is only your money. It's literally only your money. Even if you have a spousal RRSP, as soon as that pops into your name, you have a contributing spouse to it, you get to decide what's done with those funds. They're just giving you that money.
And they get to take the deduction.
Yeah, and they take the deduction, exactly.
But yeah, I think that is a very dangerous mindset to get into. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later in the episode. But, when divorce does happen and women typically, I hate to stereotype it, haven't been involved in investing, they are now completely overwhelmed, or they have no idea how much money they have, or maybe their husband or partner has left them in a terrible financial situation and they're broke.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see it a lot where, especially in terms of debt too, you kind of have to know where each other is at, not just on the investment side, but also on the debt side, because whether or not you're both jointly liable on that debt, if you separate, you are still responsible for that debt, even though it's not in your name.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which is huge. And so we'll definitely talk about that as well. So the other thing that I wanted to point out, either before you get married or cohabitate or shortly thereafter, start talking about time that you intend to take out of the workforce. So we usually think about this in terms of children. So my husband and I talked about it, like, how much paternity leave would you like to take ideally? How much maternity leave would you like to take ideally? Would you like to take any extra years? So we already knew before having our child what we wanted to do in an ideal world. It didn't work out that way where we were career-wise. He couldn't take off as much time as he wanted to. I ended up taking a lot more time than I wanted to. And that was just based on income and the jobs that we had at that time. But it was nice to know what our ideal situation, what we wanted it to look like. And we had a bunch of money saved up in order to facilitate that too.
And I think that's so important that both spouses are involved in that conversation, especially in 2019 with more men taking paternity leave, because for things to ultimately get equal in the workforce and in the financial gaps between men and women, I think men do have to start taking more leave. So it is a great thing to talk about early on.
Yeah. And I think just having that plan in place too, if things change, if you realize that the person who wanted to take more time off now is really itching to get back to work, or if the person who said, no, I'm gonna float us, I can definitely handle that, needs to take time off. There's a huge mental health portion of having kids and having that kind of upheaval in your life that can not really be planned for, but you can be prepared for.
Absolutely. And being flexible, of course, when life hits is key. And I mean, kids, I don't have kids, but I have seen how much change they can bring to a family. So of course, always good to be flexible. But yeah, talking about those things early on and making sure that there is no resentment again, so that down the road, you're hopefully, I guess, avoiding divorce is important.
I think avoiding divorce is hugely important. In the short term, it's definitely going to negatively impact men from what I've read, and the long term, going to negatively impact the woman in the relationship. We're obviously looking at this like hetero, but I think even for same gender, same sex couples, you're going to see the same thing, because you're getting joint income, joint assets with joint expenses, which usually bumps up the asset column, lowers your expenses column a little bit. Now you're going to have higher expenses and lower income, right? So it's super important. The next thing I wanted to bring up was prenups. You could look at this, but basically from what I've seen, from what my husband and I looked at before we got married, was unless you have a huge number of assets before you go into the relationship, not worth it.
And when we're talking huge number, it's probably like in the millions.
Yeah, substantial, hundreds of thousands we kind of saw. If you have a house and you really want to protect that investment, if your parents gifted you your down payment, there are other ways to go about protecting that than a prenup.
So before we got married, we also looked at a prenup, and I think it was kind of up in the air as well. We found that I think I had a bit more assets to my name, just because I had not lived on my own as long and benefited from working a little bit while I was living at home, and same with university. And my partner had a little bit more student loan debt. So we kind of figured that it would, in a sense, even it out over the course of our marriage, and it has. So I think, yeah, when you're looking at whether or not to get a prenup, you really have to have like a large amount of assets.
Yeah, and certain type of assets too, because something that happened while we were already cohabitating is I received an inheritance. Something good to know is inheritance are fully protected as long as you can track the cash flow. So,
Did not know that.
Yeah. So don't share your inheritance if you're worried about getting divorced, I guess. So if you're thinking about divorce, or if you're kind of in the middle of your relationship and you've already passed this, definitely have the conversations if you haven't already. But I think sort of attributing a cost or a section of your budget to preventing divorce as well, whether that be date nights. My husband and I did that a lot, especially in the first year of our child's birth, the first year and a half. It was a struggle. It was tough. And just being able to go out on our own and talk about adult things, revisit where we were emotionally, financially, or just, relax and have a beer together was great and worth every penny. Also, marital counseling, definitely something to consider. Even touch base. Something we heard about a long time ago and now we do is, I don't think we've done it in a year, but we just kind of every year revisit it and say that we still want to be together. We're still here for each other. And we're going to keep going forward together.
And I think those check-ins are important to also understand where the other person's at. And if we all have struggles in our relationship and ups and downs, and, spending as expensive as counseling is, I think can be incredibly beneficial to increase communication within a couple. And maybe that's all it is. Maybe, it was something very simple that was driving you both nuts and you learn how to handle it. As well, I've seen individuals that are getting divorced go through counseling so that they can actually amicably deal with the breakup, especially when there are kids involved, so that there isn't this animosity and anger within the couple as they continue to live together, maybe with the kid, or as they start to separate. They have a safe place to go and start to work out what living separately looks like.
Yeah. And I mean, once you have kids, it's not as though you're going to be able to write your former partner off. You're going to be seeing them for the rest of at least the child's life.
And you may have financial implications where one spouse has to pay alimony or child support payments. So it's really in everyone's best interest to get on the same page financially as well as emotionally.
Yeah, exactly. And I think counseling can be money well spent. I mean, if it's going to be preventing divorce, I'd definitely rather pay the counselor now than pay a lawyer later and split the assets later.
As expensive as therapists are, lawyers charge way more per hour. So I definitely agree with you on that one.
Yeah. So another thing I threw in here was if you already know you're on the track to separation and divorce, or you just think your partner is not being upfront, look for income and debt mismatches. Like, I feel like you know how much your partner is bringing in. You have an idea of what's being spent. If you start to notice that maybe things aren't lining up, it has been known for partners to have hidden savings accounts, hidden checkings accounts, or just stashing cash. So definitely look for that. Another thing to look for is perhaps they're struggling with a gambling addiction. That can cause a lot of debt. You are responsible for 50% of that debt. It's horrible, but you will very likely have to take that on.
As well, I think it's, again, so important to be involved in your finances as a couple, so that you can, start to see those discrepancies. If there is an addiction, whether it be gambling or alcohol or drugs, you will start to see, probably cash withdrawals for those things. Especially if they're embarrassed by, if it's illegal, if it's drugs, then of course they're going to pay with cash. But if it's something that they're embarrassed about, maybe gambling or alcohol or whatever, you're probably going to start to see a lot of cash withdrawals or, transactions on the credit card. And they might just assume you're not going to look at that, especially, I think, unfortunately, a lot of times men think that women just aren't paying attention to money. Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's not large amounts, it can definitely, get drained pretty effectively, unfortunately.
Yeah, it adds up for sure. $20 every couple of days. Yeah. That's a few $100s a month.
Yeah. So watch your ABM withdrawals. Another thing too, if you're the person if you're taking time out from work, if you're staying home with kids, that kind of thing, and something that I thought about when I was on mat leave, think about income streams. So you don't necessarily have to be working to have an income or start building up some sort of security to generate income. That's just something to think about. Also, maintaining your own credit history. So if you had a credit card from when you were working, keep it. Even if you don't use it that much, use it occasionally for sure. I wouldn't, in this case, recommend lowering the limit. I would recommend keeping it even if you know you're never going to use it, because if the worst happens, you get separated or loss of your partner, you now have no credit facility in just your name. That can be devastating and take years and years and years to build up that credit history.
One thing I wanted to jump back to from the stash account perspective, and we kind of talked about it more so from the, perspective of finding your spouse's stash account. Do you ever think it's valuable for, in this case, we'll choose a woman who maybe hasn't been working, doesn't have an income stream? Do you think it is ever valuable if she's wanting to leave a relationship to start pulling money out if maybe she's in a relationship that's not healthy?
Yeah, if you're in a relationship that's not healthy, and I was going to touch on that at the end, we'll definitely be linking to some resources for that. Regardless of who's controlling your finances or your living situation, or if you feel like you have nothing, your life is not worth more than your finances, obviously. So yes, if you're in an abusive relationship, it might be prudent to start squirreling some money away. Trusted friend, get some help. There are lots of resources that we'll be able to link to in our show notes. If you're in a regular relationship though, I would not advocate for it. When you go through mediation and if you go to court, you're going to be required to put forward all your banking accounts, all your assets, everything like that. And if you're not willing to do that, you're not being ethical, you're not being legally responsible for that. If you're going to be staying at home and you're not going to be the higher income earner, talk to your partner about having a separate account that's just in your name, just for you to draw income off of if something happens.
Absolutely. And you don't want to perjure yourself, and that is illegal. So you need to make sure that you're staying, in the lines of the law, but also taking care of yourself. And I think, again, if you're not sharing accounts with your partner, maybe making sure you do have certain accounts in your name that have, a few $1,000s just in case.
Yeah. Okay. So minimizing the impacts of divorce. I think we've talked about this pretty extensively. Having your own credit cards, having your own investments, having a way to generate income either in thought or in practice. Be involved in your everyday household cost and decision making. And then I guess, as a fallback, I guess it kind of branches off of the stash accounts, but have a good support system outside of your marriage. Know that there are financial planning divorce experts. It's a whole thing. There's also lawyers, there's resources that you can get for free, that kind of stuff. So have a good network outside of your marriage, but also know that there are other things that you can fall back on. So our pink tax rebate for this one is wherever you're at in your relationship, have an open discussion about finances, goals, and expectations. Start making plans for the future, whether it's a budget for relationship building activities or for planning your exit strategy. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode.
As always, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and leave a 5-star review. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to share your money story using the hashtag FemFinances.